In this video, I'm going to be focusing our attention on clinical depression or major depressive disorder and how you can treat and prevent it. This video is divided into 3 sections. The first section is going to focus on the problems associated with depression, the symptoms we might call them. I'm then going to look at the underlying causes. What are the factors that can often result in an individual experiencing depression? And then I'm going to be looking at treatment and prevention options. Hi, I'm Mork-chadwick. I'm a psychologist and I'm absolutely passionate about helping people move away from a lifetime of chronic medication and moving towards taking back control of their own health and well-being. So let's kick off by looking at the problems associated with clinical depression. As you may be aware, the problems involve our feeling and emotional functioning. We are also impacted at a cognitive or thinking level of functioning, and our physical functioning as well is impacted negatively. So let's start with the problems associated with our physical functioning. There's almost always a change that is experienced in one's sleep patterns as well as in one's appetite. What many people find when they go into a depressive episode, as it's termed, is that their sleep patterns become disrupted. They either find that it is hard to fall asleep, in other words, insomnia creeps in, or if they fall asleep quite quickly, they'll often find they wake up during the night, around about 12, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. They may fall asleep after an hour or so, but they're likely to wake up again. Whatever the situation, most people who go into a depressive episode find that they don't get a full night of unbroken sleep. Similarly, with appetite, most people who go into a depression find that their appetite deteriorates, it diminishes. They lose their sense of hunger. You may find, though, that if you've gone into a depressive episode and your appetite has left you, that actually you're eating a lot of food. It's probably because you've resorted to emotional eating, comfort eating, and that is often the case. Fatigue is another very common problem. Many people will complain of having no energy to do anything. And the deeper you drop into a depressive episode, the harder you're going to find it to get out of bed in the morning and to engage with daily living. The last physical problem I want to talk about is what we call psychomotor retardation and or psychomotor agitation. So the word psychomotor involves psyche, the mind, and motor, which has to do with the body and movement. So psychomotor retardation simply suggests that you may find that your brain and your body become dumbed down, as it were. There's not much going on up here, and your body is feeling like it can't do much either. Some people experience psychomotor agitation, which is the exact opposite. Your mind is never still. Your mind is restless, and physically your body is restless as well. And if you're particularly unlucky, you may in fact experience both of these. Now, if we move on to how our cognitive or thinking functioning is affected, one of the most important symptoms or problems is this. Indecision. You're very likely to find it harder and harder to make even the most basic and simple decisions. For example, should I have oats for breakfast or should I have muesli? And then you find yourself having to ask your partner or your spouse or whoever might be living with you. It's not life-changing decisions that are hard. Those are always hard. It's the simple daily decisions which become really difficult. Another very common symptom is your short-term memory becomes affected. You will find it harder and harder to hold information for any length of time, anything beyond a few seconds even. You may find you put your keys down somewhere and then you've forgotten where you've put them and you spend the rest of the day looking for them. You may be in an interaction with a friend and directly after that conversation you've forgotten half of what was spoken about. Another symptom this is what we might term attentional ability. And your attentional ability is really just about being able to focus your attention for an extended period of time. But with depression, that also deteriorates. And you find your mind wandering a lot of the time. So you're just not able to stay focused. Whether it's focused on the TV, focused on what you're writing on your laptop, focused on a conversation with someone, you'll find your mind wanders. Negative thinking is another cognitive problem that people will experience. And really all it means is that you'll find it almost impossible to think positive thoughts. It's impossible to see the light at the end of the tunnel, as it were. And what is especially hard about this problem is that you'll be able to very quickly see that your friends and family possibly don't like to spend time with you because you're so negative, because we become so cynical, it seems, to those outside. The final problem is suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation is what we're saying here is that you have suicidal thoughts. Now this is different from being actively suicidal, which means you've started to plan how you're going to kill yourself, when you'll kill yourself, and where you'll kill yourself. Suicidal ideation are thoughts. You've started to wonder what it's like to be dead, what it might be like to end your life. This is not as serious or as significant as being actively suicidal, but if you start having suicidal thoughts, which are very common, you do need to speak with someone, whether it is a trusted friend or a trusted family member, or perhaps your doctor or a psychologist. It does need to be spoken about. Now, if we move across to how our emotional functioning is negatively impacted, one of the first and most common emotions that is associated with a depressive episode is this one. A sense or a feeling of hopelessness. And it's easy to understand this, especially if you've had depression in the past. If you try the medication, you try the psychotherapy, perhaps you've even made some lifestyle changes, and yet nothing seems to be working, hopelessness will creep in. And often, with hopelessness comes that suicidal ideation, if not active suicidality. So you do need to monitor yourself and your levels of hopelessness. Two other very commonly experienced emotions are the following. Guilt and shame. They're both fairly easy to understand, I think. Many of us who've experienced depression or who are in a depressive episode now will experience quite high levels of guilt. We feel guilty because we start to feel we're a burden on those we love. We start to feel that we cause our friends and family to worry about us. And so many of us feel a lot of intense guilt. Shame is another awful emotion to experience. And often when we're in a depressive episode, shame is highlighted. But it's easy to understand, I think. There are such high levels of social stigma attached to having mental health problems, like depression, that we often feel ashamed that we've allowed ourselves to go into a depressive episode. So shame is very easy to understand, just because of the social stigma that exists. But family and friends, unfortunately, often have the habit of saying things which they believe or hope will motivate us to get out of our depression. But the things they say often make us feel even more ashamed. So friends and family might say things like, "But look, you have nothing to be depressed about. You have a wonderful job, a loving spouse, a nice house. Come on, see if you can pull yourself out of this." And of course, it's not that easy. It's in fact relatively impossible to think oneself out of a depression. But we get left feeling like we have failed. So shame is a very common emotion. We also find the following. Our self-esteem, our self-confidence, our sense of self-worth deteriorates. It's a very common symptom. And it's partly because we feel like we are failing and letting down family and friends. A depressed mood, for many of us who have dropped into a depression, is very common. And this just means we feel tearful, sad, down, blue, however you want to phrase it, just about every day of the week, most of the day. But it's not everyone who experiences a depressed mood. Some will experience a loss of interest and pleasure in just about everything. So those activities that you used to love engaging with, those hobbies, often you'll find yourself thinking, I'm just not interested, or sure, I'm not motivated to do this anymore, or I just don't have the energy. Well, that's this problem. This is one of the key symptoms for many people. There are some who experience very few of these symptoms, but who experience this. Increasing levels of irritability. In other words, things that used to annoy them a little now really annoy them a lot and very quickly. People who used to have this much patience now find that their fuse is this short. When others do silly things that may have been a little irritating, now often you'll find that you lose your cool. And there may be some sort of uncontrolled outburst that follows regularly. It's a very common problem associated with depression. So these are some of the most common symptoms or problems associated with clinical depression and the depressive episode. What I'm going to do now is move on to the next section in this video, and that's to focus on the underlying causes, the factors that are known to have some impact on whether depression occurs or not. Here we are looking at the causes of depression. Now this for me is a very important part of this video. The research is showing very clearly that there are certain underlying factors that are common to almost everyone who drops into a depressive episode. First of all though, what we have to understand is that we are more likely to experience depression if we have one or both of the following. So a genetic predisposition and or a psychological vulnerability. Now, what do both of these mean? Well, the genetic predisposition simply means that you have the genes that make it more likely that you will experience depression. And those genes might come from your mother's side of the family and or your father's side of the family. And it's not just one gene involved in depression, it's a range of genes that make you more or less likely to experience depression. That's what the research suggests at the moment. If you don't have a genetic predisposition, then you may have what we call a psychological vulnerability. Now what that involves is usually what can we say, an inability for you to bounce back from difficulty. In other words, your psychological or emotional resilience is perhaps less than it might otherwise be. And what would cause that? Well, it's usually found in your formative years. And it's usually that one or more of your basic emotional or psychological needs were not met adequately in those first 10, 15, or 20 years of life. So, an example of this would be if your mother, on giving birth to you, soon afterwards fell into a postnatal or postpartum depression. And if that wasn't treated, it's quite possible that she wasn't able to meet your needs, your emotional needs especially, effectively. That would result in a psychological vulnerability. But similarly, if as a teenager, an adolescent, your family moved home, you moved to a new city or town, you started at a new high school perhaps, but you found it very difficult to fit in. You never had a sense of actually belonging. You found it difficult to make friends with the new kids. Maybe you were bullied or teased for an extended period of time. That too would result very likely in some sort of psychological vulnerability to future mental health problems and or depression. again, you would just be less likely to bounce back from crisis and difficulty as an adult. Now, those underlie, for many people, depression. But there is something more important that I need to share with you, and this is a common factor throughout the chronic health problems that people experience. It's chronic systemic inflammation. So what is chronic systemic inflammation? Well, if you think about cutting your hand, very quickly what you find is that the skin where the cut or wound is a darker color than the surrounding skin. It's often a little raised or swollen. It's sensitive to the touch, and in fact, the cut or the wound might be a little warmer than the surrounding skin. Now that's what we call acute localized inflammation. So acute means it's short term, it'll be there for a day or so. Localized, it only happens at the cut. And inflammation, well, that refers to the body's immune processes. The immune cells have been sent to the cut to kill the pathogenic organisms that might be collecting there, the germs. Now that's healthy inflammation, that you want. It allows the wound to heal quickly. It's very different from chronic systemic inflammation. Chronic systemic inflammation is inflammation that occurs throughout the body and brain. It affects the cells and tissues throughout your body and brain. And so it involves neuroinflammation. And neuroinflammation is just inflammatory processes that affect the neurons and the tissues that make up your brain. And it's not good for us. When neuroinflammation occurs, we often find that there are problems with the neurotransmitters, the brain chemicals, that allow our brain to function optimally. Now, there are a range of brain chemicals involved, and I will talk about those in a short while. Before we get here, what I want to ask is, why do some of us experience chronic systemic inflammation? And it's a question you might have been asking yourself. Well, there are a range of things that result in chronic systemic inflammation and neuroinflammation. And I'm going to draw those up here now. These are possibly the four most important factors underlying most chronic systemic inflammation: an unhealthy diet, poor sleep patterns, a sedentary lifestyle, and poorly managed chronic stress. So, how does this work? Well, an unhealthy diet involves eating a lot, or including these in our diets every day, the following substances: sugar, refined carbohydrates, processed food, or chemically laden food, and cooking in seed oil. If those are making up your diet on a daily basis, then this is going to result, because those are all inflammatory foods. Poor sleep means that you're not sleeping an unbroken, good quality 7 to 9 hours a night, for whatever reason. If you're working late into the evening on your laptop or on your electronic device, you'll probably find you don't fall asleep easily, or you just sleep for much less than you need. A sedentary lifestyle means a lifestyle which involves almost no level of exercise or movement or activity, and our bodies and brains need to move. And poorly managed chronic stress, well, that is known to result in a regular stress response occurring within our bodies and brains. And the stress response involves the release of stress hormones, specifically cortisol, which over time also results in chronic systemic inflammation. So, if one or more of these are a part of your life, then this will be a part of your experience. That as well, which then has an impact on the neurotransmitter levels in your brain. And usually, it would seem, neuroinflammation means that your neurotransmitters are less available, and your brain therefore cannot function at an optimal level. Now, the neurotransmitters that are most usually unavailable are the following. Serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. And you may struggle with a lack of just one of them. Often it is serotonin. But many folk who drop into a depressive episode are struggling with the lack of 2 or 3 neurotransmitters. And it'll be up to your psychiatrist to determine which ones are not available at the quantities they should be. So here's a summary of what might be causing or playing a large role in your depression. Let's move on from here to the third section of this video, and that is to look at the treatment options and how to prevent depression from being a part of your life. In other words, how to prevent relapse into a depressive episode. So, on to section 3, treatment and prevention. How do we treat depression when you're in the middle of a depressive episode? Well, have a look. Medication and psychotherapy are, it seems, according to the scientific research, the best combination, especially during the early stages of a depressive episode. Now, there must be over 100 antidepressants on the market. It will be up to your general practitioner or psychiatrist to determine which antidepressant to try. And depending on the problems and symptoms that you have been experiencing, most psychiatrists will be able to make a very well-educated guess as to the medication that will work for you. Unfortunately, this is not always the case, and you may have to stop one medication because it's just not working and start with a new one. So medication is, I think, quite critical in the early stages of a depression. Psychotherapy is something that we as psychologists are able to provide. It, in the early stages of a depression, is, I think, often very important. And if you're able to continue with it, it might be useful as well. But what's more important is that once you start to feel your mood lifting, your energy levels creeping back in, your levels of motivation improving because of the medication, then it's time to start looking at the following ways in which you can stop yourself from ever going back into a depression. Sleep hygiene simply refers to the fact that you need to start ensuring you get a better night's sleep. And at first, it might be useful to use medication to help you do this. But this should not be a long-term thing. There are so many different ways that you can help your brain fall asleep. The first one is to turn off all electronic devices 2 to 3 hours before you shut your eyes. And the reason for that is that our electronic devices nowadays almost all have LED screens. And an LED screen, whether it's on a smartphone, a tablet, a laptop, a computer screen, or a television, those LED screens emit blue light. And blue light prevents the production of the sleep hormone melatonin in our brain. There's a little gland called the pineal gland, and as the light in the day starts to become more yellow, which is in the afternoon and early evening, the pineal gland is switched on and melatonin is produced to be released into the brain. It helps us feel drowsy and fall asleep. But if you're on your electronic device until you shut your eyes, the pineal gland won't have produced much, if any, melatonin, and you will probably then struggle to fall asleep. If you do fall asleep, it's possible it will be a very light sleep and that you'll wake up throughout the night. So one of the first things you've got to do if you want to get better sleep during the evening is to make sure your LED devices are turned off 2 to 3 hours before you fall asleep, before you close your eyes. The other thing is the temperature of your room. Is it between about 15 and 19 degrees centigrade? Because that is the best temperature for us to fall asleep. So you have your shower or your bath, you climb into bed all nice and warm, but if the ambient or the air temperature around you is between 15 and 19, you will probably fall asleep and stay asleep during the evening. Also, when do you eat your last meal? Is it between 6 and 6:30, or is it later? Well, if you can keep your last meal of the day to before 6:30 p.m., then your body is going to respond better. The food will be digested by the time you shut your eyes, and you'll be able to have a good night's sleep. The fourth thing that you can be doing is bringing movement, activity, and exercise into your daily life. And this is especially good first thing in the day. Cardiovascular exercise, the research is suggesting, has an especially significant impact on brain functioning and brain health. Cardiovascular exercise is protective of brain cells and brain tissue. It also helps in the creation of new brain cells in certain parts of our brains. And if you can do about 150 minutes of cardiovascular exercise, which simply means you get your heart rate lifted and you feel perhaps a bit sweaty. So it could be a brisk walk, a jog, a swim, cycle, a dance in your living area. Any of those forms of movement and activity, well, they're cardiovascular. And as I say, 150 minutes per week is exactly what your brain is asking for. The next thing you can do is to look at your diet. Healthy eating. Well, it seems that for all of us as human beings, we can benefit from cutting out sugar, refined carbohydrates, processed or chemically laden foods, and seed oils. Corn oil, sunflower oil, those are inflammatory. All of those foods are pro-inflammatory and are likely to result in your gut experiencing some level of inflammation, which very quickly can result in inflammation throughout your body and brain. Social connection. I can't stress the importance of this enough. The research is suggesting that our relationships with significant people, especially those who can give us emotional support, well, it's incredibly important for healing from mental health problems and for ensuring that a relapse doesn't occur. So all I can encourage you to consider is to make sure, even if you're in a depression, to reach out, to connect with those friends and family who you trust. Those friends and family who are not going to judge you because you're in a bad state of mind. You've got to do more of that. Social connections is critical. The final change that you can make in your life is the following. And I've termed it stress reduction. If you can take on some training, whether it's online or face-to-face with a psychologist or within a group, training that enables you to manage your stress effectively and reduce your stress levels, then you will be doing your body and brain a huge favor. Poorly managed chronic stress is a killer. And it's because, as I said, the stress response is continually being triggered. And with that stress response comes the release of stress hormones like cortisol, which over an extended period of time, and we're talking weeks and months, has a very profound inflammatory effect on body and brain. What I'd like to say is that mindfulness for myself personally has been a huge help in enabling me to manage my stress more effectively. So mindfulness-based stress reduction is something you might like to consider. There are numerous courses available online, and I myself offer an 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction program, the details of which are going to be shown at the end of this video. These 5 lifestyle changes are absolutely critical in my mind to ensure that you come out of a depression, but more importantly to ensure that you never relapse back into a depression. Medication is going to be very important to allow you to engage with those lifestyle changes. And unfortunately, if you've had numerous depressive episodes throughout your life, you may very well have to stay on an antidepressant as a chronic medication. But for those of us who have just for the first time perhaps fallen into a depressive episode, it's usually the case that you can let go of the medication between 6 to 12 months after you started taking it. But you absolutely have to speak with your doctor or psychiatrist to be certain of that. Please don't just let your medication go because you're feeling better. It could be the very worst thing you do. Usually antidepressants need an extended weaning off process, and that's something you need to get guidance about from your general practitioner or your psychiatrist. But once you're off the medication, you need to rely on those lifestyle changes and perhaps a bit of psychotherapy now and again. I hope you've learned something from this video, and best of luck going forward.